Hello, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smoko podcast. My name is Alexis Armstrong, your host. Nice to meet you. The Smoko podcast is the place to celebrate and highlight women, trans women, and non binary folk working within STEM and trade occupations. So please tune in, take a break, join us. We are on Smoko. And today we are extremely lucky to be joined by the lovely Dr. Becky Robinson, who is a friend, colleague, mentor, just an overall amazing person. And she is a professor of oceanography at the University of Rhode Island. Her specialty is in marine geology and geochemistry, and it's looking at biogeochemistry and paleoceanography. So, looking specifically at marine nitrogen and its relation to the global carbon cycle and how that's related to climate change. And so we're going to kind of talk all things nitrogen, talking about its global cycle. We're also going to talk about anthropogenic nitrogen and how that's entered into the system, how that affects ecosystems. And we're also going to talk about her experience in the field on marine expeditions because she is also the U.S. chair of the U.S. Advisory Committee to Scientific Ocean Drilling. So we're also going to talk about ocean drilling as well. Becky, thank you so much for coming on to the show. It is so nice to see you.
Thanks for having me. It's wonderful to see you.
You're
It's been
welcome.
so long.
It has been so long. I think we met way back in the day. I want to say that we met back in like 2016. I can't even really remember it, but
I think that's right.
it is so nice to see you. And thank you for coming on to the show. Maybe to start us off, this is an oldie but a goodie. And I feel like I always ask this question is because it's always so weird is how people got into the field that they got into. And I was wondering if you could kind of walk through how you first discovered geology and then what drew you to the field of oceanography.
Sure. Kind of accidentally. So I went to college. I knew I wanted to do science. I thought I wanted to be a biology major, but I only sort of liked my first biology course. And I felt like this was particularly problematic because it was
Mm.
team taught by 4 of the 5 faculty in the department.
Oh,
And
no.
so it didn't seem like a good fit, right? I was
Mhm.
like, So the next semester I enrolled in historical geology just out of curiosity, and I was totally hooked. There were rocks and fossils. There was
Mm.
maps. We colored. We had to buy colored pencils. It was awesome. We went on field trips that involved, you know, getting dirty
Mhm.
and finding stuff. And both the professor and the TA were really engaging. And so they made it come alive. And so I decided, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to switch gears. It's still science and it makes me happy. And I did really well in this department, but
Mhm.
this department was really focused on like old metamorphic rocks and minerals, granite schist type
Yeah. The like
rocks.
classic rocks. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was really good at mineralogy and
Mm.
petrology, but I kind of knew I wanted to do something more related to water.
Mm.
And so I did a summer Sea Education Association program
Okay.
and we took a core. And I got off that boat and I was like, I want to do more coring. And I went back and I started asking my professors, like, how can I do this for grad school? And I did.
That's so cool that you guys took a core back in undergrad. That's amazing.
Yeah. And it was like, we extruded it on the deck and we looked through it. And I think we measured pebbles or
Yeah.
maybe number of shells per centimeter, something
Mhm.
that you could do easily at sea without a ton of analytical equipment because it was a sailboat.
Mhm. So cool.
So, yeah, it was kind of neat. So that's kind of how it started.
I love that story. And why water? Like what kind of drew you to water? And then in your like PhD and going into academia, how did you know that you were like, yeah, I'm going to really focus on biogeochemistry? How did that specialty and the love of that specialty happen?
There's such a huge element of luck to finding
Mm.
these kinds of things. And so I don't actually entirely know why water. I know that I took an aqueous geochemistry course, and I think I found that to be slightly more like it resonated with me more than just memorizing the mineral
Nices.
like
Yeah.
structure of silicates or something.
Hmm.
I don't know. And maybe because it was more applied and I was so sort of scientifically immature that I needed that. I did a senior thesis about like transport and weathering on river
Hmm.
shelves in Alaska. And so that I
Cool.
think helped also me being like, oh, because I got to think about like climate and
Yeah.
storage and these kinds of things. But how I became a biogeochemist is just a little bit of, I asked people where I should go to grad school. I applied to a few different places based on this hunch that I wanted to do sediment
Yeah.
coring. And I ended up going to the University of Southern California. And the project I was working on was the site survey for leg 167.
Oh,
And
cool.
my advisor said, do you want to go on leg 167 as a temporary technician?
Yeah.
And I did. And then one thing led to another.
Yeah.
And Jim Kennett told me I would never be a micropaleontologist because I wasn't very good at identifying forams. And
And here you are. Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
basically. Yeah.
Yeah. And it worked out. That's great. It's kind of cool. Like I love asking that question because it is really cool that it is so serendipitous of just kind of like one thing does lead to the other. And like you do kind of just operate on a little bit of a hunch. And then you're like, okay, well, I guess that's kind of interesting. And I'll go down that path. And then like, oh, that person knows that person. And you end up at grad school and then you end up as a professor. Like it does just snowball. But that's really cool
Yeah.
that,
I mean, one thing I think it helps is that it probably could have happened like four different ways, right? Like
yeah.
I'm curious about a lot of things, right? I'm willing to do something different at any point in my career.
Hmm.
And so I think scientists probably have a lot of serendipity because they're like not decided what they want to
Yeah.
do, right? They're like,
Yeah.
ooh, let's explore this.
Yeah. That's like the nature of a scientist, exactly, to be like excited about so many different options and kind of go down different paths and like kind of meander a little bit in career. Yeah, honestly, that probably checks, truthfully. Becky, I wanted to kind of go into like biogeochemistry and look at your research now, because your research is specific kind of to the distribution of bioavailable nitrogen, and then it's linked to the global carbon cycle, which is just so freaking cool. And I was wondering if you could explain it maybe to someone who's not within the field. So explain kind of the marine nitrogen cycle, how that's linked to carbon, and then how that's linked to climate change. And then overall, why nitrogen? Like, why are we so interested in nitrogen? What does it show us? What's kind of the big picture of understanding this nitrogen cycle?
Sure. So the nitrogen cycle is complicated. And so
Mm,
I'm going to try to distill it
okay.
down a little bit. And so I'm going to start with the first part of that question, which is you mentioned bioavailable nitrogen.
Hmm.
And so what on earth is bioavailable nitrogen? So when we are pretty young, we learn that the Earth's atmosphere is mostly nitrogen, right?
Hmm.
N2. And so why is the nitrogen so important to life if it's like, freely in the milieu
Everywhere.
around us?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's because it's not available to most organisms on Earth. It has this triple bond that's
Hmm.
super hard to break. And as N2, it's not that useful. So when we think of the nitrogen cycle in the ocean, we're thinking of tracing the inputs, movements, and removal of this nitrogen that has been transferred or transformed into bioavailable nitrogen. So that very first step is to break the bond, and this is nitrogen
Hmm.
fixation. And so this is done by organisms that, because we love jargon, we call diazotrophs, but we can call them nitrogen fixers here. And so these nitrogen fixers break that bond and they use the nitrogen for themselves, and then they get recycled into the ocean. So this is the principal source of new nitrogen to the ocean. There is runoff of fixed nitrogen from land because nitrogen
Hmm.
can be fixed by land related organisms, legumes. So
As
famously, we
well.
put those things in our garden, right,
Yeah.
to fix nitrogen in soil. It also is fixed by lightning strikes and things that have a lot of energy. So this may be one of the ways that we got fixed nitrogen on Earth before we had
These
microbial
fixers.
life.
Yes. Yeah. That's
Yeah,
fantastic. That's really cool.
right. So yes, there is fixed nitrogen that's run off from land and put into the ocean, but it's small compared to the newly fixed nitrogen. So if we think about the nitrogen cycle, you've got inputs that are
Hmm.
dominated by this nitrogen fixation, and then it gets transformed into multiple forms. So nitrate is the most abundant form of nitrogen. It's oxygenated. We think of the
Hmm.
ocean as a place with a lot of oxygen. And then ammonium, which is chemically more reduced form of nitrogen, and it's easy for organisms to take up. You can almost see the word amine. So nitrogen is one of the ingredients of an amino acid. And so ammonium is sort of the easily
Nice.
related
Yes.
in your
Yeah.
brain to
Yeah.
amine, right? And then also organic nitrogen. So organisms actually incorporate it into their biomass. It's part of their proteins. So the mixture of all those things is organic nitrogen. So biology is doing all this stuff, right? It's actually taking the nitrogen into the ocean. It's moving it around into these different pools. And then ultimately, it's biology that removes nitrogen from the ocean. And so the primary mechanism for that is denitrification, which is another bacterial process. In environments when we run out of oxygen, these organisms are able to then take that oxygenated nitrate or nitrite and convert it back to N2.
Very cool.
So it's biology that does the
full
full
fix.
cycle.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
It starts
it's
with
very.
yeah,
Oh, go on.
it starts with microbes and ends with microbes. It is completely a biologic
Yeah,
cycle. Yeah.
yeah, and I think it's like wonderfully Gaian in that in an environment where there is not enough nitrogen, the nitrogen fixers become really important. And then if you think about the way that we get rid of nitrogen is through this anoxic process, and we get anoxic conditions in places where there's lots of organic matter, and you need a lot of nitrogen to get that. So in high nitrogen environments, oxygen gets depleted, and then the nitrogen actually tends to go away
to leave
by
the cycle.
respiration. And so it kind of balances itself out. If we get too much, we go towards denitrification. If we get not enough, have to ramp up
production. Very, very cool. Yeah, it's this like beautifully like symmetrical system. And Becky, how do you take that and then you relate it back to carbon? How's that linked to the carbon cycle?
Okay, so on geologic timescales and on a whole ocean timescale, because of those feedbacks, the nitrogen cycle is relatively balanced. But there are places in the ocean where there is not enough nitrogen, and it limits biological productivity, which means it limits the drawdown of carbon into the ocean. Okay. And then there are places in the ocean where there's lots of nitrogen, and those places are drawing down carbon like crazy. And so on like day-to-day timescales, nitrogen is absolutely essential for carbon fixation, for photosynthesis, for this process that actually sort of regulates the movement of carbon, at least through biology. And so that's one of the ways. So we can't change the inventory of nitrogen in the ocean unless we can like create some sort of imbalance between those processes, right? Like if we could have something happen that would either lower denitrification or enhance nitrogen fixation, we could create an inventory imbalance. You can start to imagine then if you have more nitrogen overall, you could pull more carbon out of the atmosphere. Yeah.
So it's acting more of a sink, right? So like nitrogen and its amount is directly tied to the amount of carbon that can be kind of stored in the ocean, which can help us trace back to the role of nitrogen in climate change, right? So we can look at is that kind of the next future of kind of modeling how carbon and climate is going to happen, and then it's tied back to nitrogen, or looking at the tie of nitrogen in terms of climate? Is that kind of the goal?
I mean, I think there's two different components to it. One is that the nitrogen's control on carbon drawdown, and then the other is that one of the intermediaries in denitrification is nitrous oxide, N2O, and it's a wicked good greenhouse gas.
Yes, it is.
So, I chose that word intentionally, right? Because it's, it's bad, but it's good at its job. It's two-pronged, right? Like, so the overall amount of nitrogen plays a role, and where it is plays a role in how well the ocean can take up carbon. But there's also this component where if we have lots of denitrification, we could actually be putting more greenhouse gases into the ocean. And so it's like, and that, and right, and there's an oxygen component in there, right? So we can think of everything sort of simplistically, but then oxygen has got a biology factor, but it's also physical, right? Like you've got to get the oxygen into the ocean, and that's a temperature thing. And so it becomes very
complicated.
It's like complicated, but it's linked to these big processes that are really, I mean, life needs oxygen, right?
Mhm.
So,
The 3 big players of life, basically, nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, like, they're all intrinsically linked, and it's kinda understanding that cycle and understanding where it is along the cycle, at what destination of the ocean, like, at what point of the ocean, and how they're interacting. So it's very, very cool research. It's very complicated research, and it's so kinda topical. It has a direct impact to climate. And I was wondering, you talked about a couple of things that I was wondering if you could maybe dive into it a little bit more about how nitrogen limits biological productivities, and also these things called global anoxic events of when there is no oxygen. And then we're talking about nitrogen fixation in these events, right? That kind of, you talked about the two end goals of the cycle of nitrogen, the very start and the very end of it. Could you maybe describe them a little bit more in detail? And then again, why would we be interested in this, and what does that kind of show us? And maybe the kind of third question of that, if we can get there, is what controls that other than nitrogen? Are they found only in one area of the ocean? Are they found in one time period? Kind of what causes these anoxic events?
okay, that's big.
I know it's
Okay,
big.
so fundamentally, nitrogen is one of the key ingredients for life.
Mhm.
So if we think of life as a recipe, if we have a recipe that calls for 3 eggs and we only have 5 eggs, we can't double that recipe.
Yeah.
So nitrogen is limiting to biological productivity because we need to make proteins. We need to
Mm.
make the machinery for life. But it's a really important question, and it's big because I just told you that biology, some forms of biology can fix nitrogen. So
Mhm.
why is it ever limiting if somebody could
Can fix it.
potentially then
Yeah.
fix it? And so
Mhm.
it turns out that, I did say it's energetically expensive, but they're not everywhere because there are other things that need to be available to fix nitrogen, because it's not just, an eggs and
One.
flour recipe,
Yeah.
right? It's eggs and flour and oil and spices and everything. And so in this case, the two key players for nitrogen fixers that we generally think about are phosphorus, which
Mm.
is probably, next in line after
Yeah.
nitrogen as controlling nutrients. And on geologic timescales, it may be more important than nitrogen because we can't biologically bring it in,
Mhm.
or iron.
Mm.
And so iron is actually the nitrogenase enzyme for most organisms has a big iron center, and that without iron, they can't make the enzyme that fixes nitrogen. And so nitrogen fixation is hard and it's expensive and it requires other things. And so that's why it has the potential to limit biological productivity, because you have to have, you
A
know,
perfect
um,
recipe, a Goldilocks window to be able to even fix it, or else even it's just not
right.
gonna happen. Okay.
I will say that we used to learn that it was very limited in
Mhm.
the ocean. It had to be low biological productivity because these organisms would be outcompeted by anything if there was
Mhm.
nitrogen available. It had to be warm. And it's not true. We're finding nitrogen fixers in the Arctic and in the Antarctic, and we're finding it in sediments where it's dark, if they have the right sort of sulfate reducers. Like,
Amazing. Yeah,
just
they
like everything we are learning about the microbial world, if there's energy to be gained, there
mhm.
is something that can do that activity. And
So cool.
so I think we don't know all of the limits on nitrogen fixation. I think we might surmise that it's often the rate limiting step to
Mhm.
productivity. And so then that sort of gives us a limitation there. Okay, so that was the first question. So why is it limiting to
Yes.
biology? I'm trying to
Yeah.
break it down in my brain.
No, thank you. I
Um,
appreciate it.
and then how does it tie into global anoxia?
Anoxic events. Yes, exactly. And kinda why are those events so important, and what controls those events other than nitrogen?
It's that's a really tricky thing. So there are these periods in Earth history where there's widespread evidence that there was no oxygen available to organisms in the
Mhm.
ocean. And this is like, there's not a
Through
lot of
time.
organisms that can live in
Yeah.
low oxygen conditions. Probably the more famous ones have like numbers to them: ocean anoxic event one
Yes.
C.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about. People get
I
really
do.
excited on the drill ship when those intervals come up. And so these are in the Cretaceous. And probably these are some combination of warming,
Mm-hmm.
like really warm waters, because it's hard to dissolve oxygen into warm waters, and
Yeah.
ocean circulation.
Yeah.
So imagine it's hard to get the oxygen in, and then you also have to like kind of refresh it. And so that's a physical issue of supplying oxygen. But then it starts to sweep out nitrogen in the ocean, which might help you rebound from an
Mm-hmm.
oceanoxic event,
And switch it back
um,
on again, that you have more
and
oxygen
switch it
all of
back
a
on
sudden.
again.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we've done some work in some of these oceanoxic events, and what we found is that what we think is happening is that nitrate's going away, but there's a lot of ammonium, which is this slightly more reduced form of nitrogen. And that may be fueling some of the high productivity after the fact. And so I'm not sure nitrogen's going to help us like get in or out. It could theoretically help us, but you have to have high productivity to draw down oxygen in some of these situations. So there are anoxic basins,
Mm-hmm.
even today, that are some combination of high respiration rates, so they have enough nitrogen to fuel photosynthesis, and low replenishment of oxygen. And it's kind of a sweet spot again where you have to get these Goldilocks conditions.
Yeah.
A lot of these basins are semi-enclosed, so it's harder to refresh
To
them.
have that circulation and have like sluggish circulation basically usually like gives it to it, that it's just this like no oxygen soup that has nothing coming into it, or it's very hard to have new water entering into the system.
Absolutely. Yeah, perfect. And then I think the other thing that we're learning is that sudden warming events or maybe volcanic outgassing could also cause some of these deep ocean anoxic conditions. But those are sort of novel proposals for
Mm-hmm.
how these change. And these are coming out of, work trying to understand the carbon isotope signatures of these systems, and also to understand like how do we get all this
Mm-hmm.
warming really rapidly, especially if it looks like it originates in the deep ocean.
Oh yeah, which is not very warm
No,
stereotypically. and
right.
And Becky, could you maybe explain why we're so interested in this, other than it being maybe this kind of cool phenomenon that happens that all of a sudden within the ocean, an area that on paper you'd think would have loads of oxygen, all of a sudden you have high productivity and then you have zero oxygen. It's been completely consumed. Why are we interested in this? Are we interested in it just because it's cool? Or are we interested because of maybe that warming aspect, that this could happen if we increase temperature in the ocean, that we could have these anoxic events? Is that kind of what drives us to study this?
It's a little bit of both. So there's a little bit of like gore gawking, right? Like
Yeah.
catastrophes really, impact events, other sort of
Changes.
disasters, they
Yeah.
really excite us because it's a puzzle that we want to figure out, like, how
Mhm.
did this happen? And so there's a little bit of this because it's cool. And I'll explain why I say it's not purely because it might happen to us. And there is evidence that the ocean in places is losing oxygen because as we warm, and it actually helps to stratify the ocean. It helps to make it harder to replenish
Mhm.
oxygen in the interior of the ocean. And we do see that there are places that are losing oxygen. And that's important because it's important for understanding the ecosystems, and it's important for understanding the trajectory that we're on.
Mhm.
However, I'm pretty sure we're not going to go from sort of some oxygen to zero oxygen very quickly. And so that's where I say it's a little bit of a it's really cool factor.
Mhm.
But oftentimes we like to think of these things as a thought experiment, right? This is the normal situation. There's a lot of oxygen, there's a lot of life. This is what the ecology looks like.
Mhm.
This is the other end
This is the
member of
extreme.
no oxygen,
Yeah.
right? And it's a little bit harder actually to tease out the intermediate things. But I will say that we have some really nice examples from the oxygen minimum zones in the Pleistocene, so the last, 2
Mhm.
million years, where they vary up and down with some regularity in the extent of oxygen associated with things like productivity and ocean circulation. There are examples in the geologic record that are not ocean anoxic events that are probably better analogies for the future for the global ocean. But if we go back to these ocean anoxic events, the dead zone in the Gulf of
Mm-hmm.
Mexico, or
Mm-hmm.
like the fish kills that we even sometimes see in estuaries, or the Baltic, like these are catastrophic. These are places that are sort of moving towards like true anoxia.
No, it changes the entire system. Like it is we're kind of speaking of it casual in a way, because if we look at the microbes and nitrogen specific, you're like, okay, it's going to be fixed. Like it doesn't have the same intensity maybe that it should have with the rest of the ecosystem. Is like when there is no oxygen, maybe microbes might be happy, but nothing else is. It is
Right.
truly a catastrophic event and an extinction event within that area. So it does have major consequence, and these kind of localized areas that are moving to anoxia are very important to understand, especially going forward. Are they going to happen more frequently? Where are they going to happen? And what are the true controls? Like kind of Becky said, is it more circulation? Is it a pattern of productivity? To kind of break down what's controlling it is going to be really, really important. Maybe that brings us into the next one a little bit. Is I know some of your work has also looked at anthropogenic nitrogen and looked at these coastal systems. And I was wondering if you could kind of describe the sources of human-made nitrogen and how they affect the ecosystem, because that's another kind of aspect of this and another problem of this cycle.
Yeah. And so, I mean, humans have a major potential to impact the ocean through their influence on the nitrogen cycle because, I mean, we, at a very first order, like 30,000 foot view, the Haber-Bosch process, which is the way to make nitrogen, N2 nitrogen into fertilizer, it's basically industrial scale nitrogen fixation, has fundamentally changed the amount of fixed nitrogen on Earth. And while it feeds the world, we add way too much fertilizer, like fertilizer in excess of anything that is required, which means that we've added a lot of fixed nitrogen to aquatic ecosystems globally, land and ocean, that have been disrupted by, just changing the ability of phytoplankton to
bioavailability,
do their
basically.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's sort of oxygen drawdown and harmful algal blooms, and this term that we lump as eutrophication, which is basically overproductive systems that become sort of just
not usable,
anoxic, and fisheries die, and just the system changes. One of the ways that you can tell locally here in the coastal estuary places that are seriously impacted is like the loss of these eelgrass beds. And then just looking around at where shell fisheries are closed because the water quality isn't great. And that's partially due to like coliform bacteria and things like that in the water column. But those things kind of go together.
They go hand in
and
hand.
So the sources so the big source, right, is that we fix more nitrogen. But we're humans and we like to live on the coast, and we eat and we poop and we fertilize our lawns. And we do all of these things, and then we have
flush
our
it back
wastewater
to the ocean. Yes, it
into
goes back to
rivers and
coastal
into the
systems.
ocean. And so we add a lot of nitrogen to the coastal system, and we have really improved our ability to pull nitrogen out of wastewater treatment facilities. We leverage these biological processes that you and I were just talking about. We actually stimulate denitrification to take it from nitrate to N2 gas to get it out of the system. But it's not perfect. It's not 100%. And then I don't know about where you live, but we live in a coastal environment that's semi-rural. So there's a lot of septic systems.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of groundwater nitrogen that can't be treated in a wastewater treatment facility, right?
And it's still going to go into the system, yes, because it's not going through general treatment.
Places like Rhode Island and Massachusetts like joined together, and they have really installed some real management limitations to what wastewater treatment facilities can release in terms of nitrogen. We've seen real changes, like decreases in the number of hypoxic days.
Amazing.
Low oxygen days, changes in the ecosystem. So we've got ecological changes that might be totally disconnected from the nitrogen, but we also have still septic systems and sewage. And so
Mhm.
we haven't really quantified what's coming from humans, what's coming from wastewater treatment facilities
And then what's
versus
new maybe.
groundwater.
Yeah.
What comes in just from the ocean, right? The
Yeah.
ocean is a it might not have very high concentrations of nitrogen, but there's a tide every day that's
Mhm.
exchanging water with much of the system. And so a little bit in a big volume frequently, it
Can have
can
an
add up.
impact.
And so I think these are interesting questions to ask. Like, how much exchange is there with the open ocean? How much are we getting from groundwater? And could some of these sort of ecosystem or phytoplankton base of the food web type changes be actually driven by other things, not by the wastewater management? And so I just look at the nitrogen because
Mhm.
it turns out that nitrogen isotopes provide us with a little bit of a fingerprint. So it turns out that when you eat nitrogen, or when an organism eats nitrogen, they tend to incorporate the isotopic composition of what they ate, and then they enrich
Oh,
it a little bit. Humans eat relatively high on the food chain, so they tend to produce a nitrogen value that is relatively elevated compared to, say, what a phytoplankton is
very
in the
cool.
ocean. And so we can sort of see, okay, the nitrate in the water has this isotopic composition, the
Mhm.
nitrate in the groundwater has this isotopic composition. That looks a lot like sewage. That groundwater must be
Oh,
coming from people's septic systems.
that's
Fixed
cool.
nitrogen,
Yeah.
so and ammonium coming from fertilizer tends to be very different. So we can start to sort of say, well, we've got a
Mhm.
fertilizer signature, we have a sewage signature, we have an offshore signature. And then that's all I do because I'm not
Yeah.
that smart. And then I work with smart people who can like incorporate that into ecological models and ask those kinds of questions.
Very cool, and get a better idea of like a holistic idea of what's happening at the ecosystem level and what's changing, how they're related. I love that idea that it has an isotopic signature. I can't believe after explaining isotopes in detail, you said you had the gall to say that you're not that smart after being like, this is all of the types of nitrogen and how they're fixed within the system. But thank you for kind of explaining and walking through how you quantify, why you would quantify it, and what else is maybe happening on these ecosystems and these coastal systems that are changing and how that's going to affect nitrogen or vice versa. How do you collect your research? Like, what does that look like? What are the steps that go into it? Kind of how do you move from getting this nitrogen? Is it mostly from sediment cores? Is it mostly from water samples? How does that work?
It starts with ideas, right?
Mm,
Like reading papers and talking to people about what's exciting and what's happening, or going to talks and being like, oh, that's really cool. And then you sort of have an idea that you think, oh, actually, I think I could make a
a
contribution
paper.
here.
Yeah. Okay.
I could do something, right? And then because everything is really expensive, that usually results in a proposal, right?
Yeah.
You need the money because really what we need is to be able to recruit students so that they can both help with the science but also become the next generation of people doing this. And so money's really critical. I love the idea generation and the proposal planning parts because I think it's
Mhm.
really exciting to think through a project and ask yourself, like, what would you do to answer the question that sort of sparked your interest and got you down this rabbit hole to begin with. But the other thing that I like about it is that you let's say it gets funded, you get the students,
Yeah.
you're training them, they start collecting data, they're like the engines of research, and
Yeah.
really good students just bring their own creativity and their energy to projects. And so remember, you've done this planning and you think you kind of know where you're going to go with it, and then they
Yeah.
are like, actually, look at this.
Yeah.
Things take on like multiple parallel lives of their own, right? And so you get so much more than you anticipate in the proposal stage by bringing in new people and new ideas, and like having a team kind
Yeah.
of energy. And so I really like that aspect of it, but like actually doing stuff. So when we work locally, I have help from my students and my lab manager, and we use the resources at the Bay campus. I'm really fortunate to be at an oceanographic institution where I have running seawater and people that are willing to sort of move things around with forklifts for me so that I can there's
See,
mesocosms. So we can
yeah,
do like experimental chamber works and things like this. And then
so
if I have to go to
cool.
sea, then I got to plan a cruise and get the right people and the right instruments out there. And so it really takes a lot of people and a lot of
Mm.
planning before you can get the data. And then, of course, you got to write it and
Yeah.
interpret it and
The
do
whole
all
kind of
those.
system of doing it, that like then you start to publish it and get it out.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love
And you do need to remember that part because it's not as fun sometimes.
no, I don't think it's on. I think the best part is always kind of that first stage. And I love that answer of like the collaboration and bringing the next generation into the project and being able to kind of have that joy and that excitement of being like, we actually have no idea really where it's going to go. We think it's going to go here, but then someone else is going to come in or the data is going to come in, and that excitement to maybe move in a new direction that we didn't have originally planned. I think that's so beautiful. And I think it's kind of quintessential to being a scientist and how science actually works. So I think that was a beautiful answer to it. And
Thanks.
I was wondering if we could maybe speak to a little bit about the scientific ocean drilling, because I know that you're the chair of the U.S. Advisory Committee to Scientific Ocean Drilling. Could you kind of speak to the benefits of a globally oriented science program? Because this is kind of like a two-part a little bit, because one of the big blows right now is the end of the JR and IODP, and kind of how we're moving to the next kind of generation or the next future of scientific drilling. What does that look like? What are kind of the benefits of having a global oriented science program, because we're about to maybe lose one of them, and what does that future look like post JR?
Yeah. So, in this role as the chair of the advisory committee to scientific ocean drilling for the US community, I have been thinking about this a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think so. Some of this is going to seem sort of like silly and obvious, but like science is bigger than like one project or even the one expedition that you go on. And this globally oriented science program with a set of standard measurements and an infrastructure for keeping data and assuring quality
Mm-hmm.
and the technical knowledge to keep moving forward and improving the science made the science bigger than that any one trip, right? Like
Yeah.
everybody's learning, but because it was a big program, it retained that knowledge.
Yeah.
And you can't understate the fact that it was an international program. So there was this like big, large scale exchange of knowledge and of cultural understanding that made opportunities for
Mm-hmm.
people outside of the drilling program. It really enriched the program and it allowed for shared resources where, maybe one nation was really good at one particular thing and another group of people was really good at something else. And so you can't understate the ability of people to put the puzzle pieces together and understand the Earth system at a much deeper level because of all of these, um,
Components or puzzle pieces
components.
of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was recently just a paper that used DSDP, ODP, IODP, total organic carbon data to
Mm-hmm.
look at burial through the Neogene, so through the last, 15 million years, let's say. But they took the data and they did some QA/QC, quality assurance and
Mm-hmm.
quality control, and they were able to tell a story that was big, like high
Huge.
level 30,000
Yeah.
foot view because
Yeah.
they were looking at the whole ocean and many years of data. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's really, it's synthetic when you're able to sort of retain the information for years and have some sort of standards going forward. And I think that it's not just the ship that we're losing potentially the program. We're
Mm-hmm.
losing the data structure, the people structure, the way to coordinate science and to vet science. Like the proposal reviewing process is
Mm-hmm.
outstanding.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Um,
true.
and it nurtures proposals through the system. So if you have a good idea and you're willing to put in the work, other people are willing to help you
Yeah,
get
it gets
to the
funneled.
end product.
Yeah.
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 So losing the ship was inevitable, right? We
Mm-hmm.
knew that the environmental impact statement would expire in 2028.
Hmm.
But what we didn't really know, and what we don't know still, is what the next steps are. We really don't know what the US is going to do in the place of what it has now. I can say what I had envisioned, which was a community that was kind of united by the shared goal of
Yeah.
acquiring and outfitting a new ship for a next
Yes.
generation of ocean
Yeah.
drilling. And that includes, ship design and preliminary science and coming together with proposals that would meet the
Threshold or the
overarching
standard. Yeah.
goals. Yeah. And nurturing science forward. And I don't give enough hope for that. I just feel like the slope towards it is like steeper and rougher
It's
than it
looking a little
was.
bit rougher. Yeah, exactly. That like to get us there, to get us kind of back on track a little bit with that program might just look a little bit rocky on the way there. But I do kind of hope that that is still the outcome and that we still have this community, because I think like you touched on a couple really important parts. One of them being the proposal process and also the streamlining of young voices within the scientific community and within early scientists to be able to have this experience to put their ideas and their research forward, to put a proposal forward, but also to link on to a project, to be like, hey, you guys are going to Greenland, like I potentially would be interested in going to Greenland, or looking at iron and looking at nitrogen in this area, like to have the multi dimensional aspect and the multi type of research that's possible from one expedition, I think is a beautiful thing. And also early career science is a beautiful thing. But I think, in my opinion, what made the program so cool, and I think what the program is so valuable, is that it's open source. It's an open, publicly available database from through time, through multiple cruises, and all around the world. You can look at that data. And because it's had a set standard of measurement, collection, and reporting, it's consistent, which is very hard to find within the scientific community. It's in the same language, it's had the same type of measurements, it's been on the same instrument, it's all been calibrated the same. That takes years and years of kind of continuity and work to create a really good data set like that. That's hard to find. So I think that's the beauty of the program, that it's so open and it's so publicly accessible, that even if you don't go on a cruise, you can still use that data and you can still move the needle forward. So
Yeah.
it does break my heart. I do hope that future is still there, because there's just so much infrastructure and so much knowledge that has been retained so far, that I just hope that it doesn't all of a sudden walk out of the door, that it stays at least functioning. Maybe different components or different parts of it, but stays functioning in a way.
I completely agree. And I think there's going to be this like period of creative adaptation to, we don't have a drill ship.
Hmm.
Can we get on a drilling platform that's being operated by another country, or can we sort of lease one as a larger group? What can we do with legacy materials that are in the repositories? How do we get something out to service an observatory?
Hmm.
Right? Like, I think we have to be really creative about thinking about these things, because no matter what we do, we won't have a ship for any time soon. So
Hmm.
I don't think that was ever not going to happen, which is part of the reason why I can be like hopeful, I guess,
Yeah.
because we were going to have to do it. And in order to get us to the next step, we would have put our heads together. And so I think we need to be not discouraged by
Hmm.
the sort of recent decisions, but push at NSF to find out what's possible, and then make it better than what they say is possible.
Yeah, to kind of move it forward. Because I think that's a good call, to be like, we were always going to lose the ship. Like, this wasn't a big, the ship was old. It was very old. I love it dearly. I love the JR. I owe the JR some wonderful years, but it was definitely old. And I think it is a good reminder to be like, it was on its way out. And we were probably going to have to make this transition point as a scientific community anyway, and as an ocean drilling community anyway. So to not be as fatalistic about it, to be like, okay, well, let's get creative about it. I think that's a good positive and hopeful mindset on it. I do.
I'm
And
not always positive and hopeful, full disclosure, but I when I'm most lucid, I am positive and hopeful.
I think that's human. I feel like I'm not positive and hopeful all the time, but like It's good when I am. When it does happen. It's a good thing. Becky, thank you so much for this interview. This was just it was so lovely reconnecting. It was so nice talking to you. It was so nice learning more about nitrogen. I hope people were mind blown by nitrogen fixers and kind of the role of the marine nitrogen cycle and how it relates to climate and how it relates to coastal ecosystems, because I think it's something that's so important and maybe not on everyone's mind, even though nitrogen should be on everybody's mind. Thank you for walking through that. Thank you for talking about ocean drilling. Just thank you for all of it. Thank you for kind of walking through everything.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this podcast. I'm going to be a listener and a subscriber. I thought I was going to listen to the Sophie Hines
Mm.
episode this weekend, but I was reading a very long dissertation. So
It's okay. It'll still be there.
it
I
was my carrot. I finished it
Yeah.
this morning.
Oh,
So.
that's amazing. That's wonderful. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. That's really nice. And it is a freaking pleasure to have this podcast. It's just so nice to talk to people and to learn more. And I enjoy it. And I hope people out there listening also enjoy it. And thank you guys for listening. I appreciate it. This has been the Smoko podcast. We will see you next week. Thank you again, Becky. It was amazing chatting with you.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.